This morning is the last in our series on encounters with God. Or at least it's almost the last. It's the last one where I'll be talking to you about a biblical figure encountering God. We do have one more Sunday at the end of August where we're hoping to be able to share your stories of encounters with God during lockdown. And you have until tomorrow to send me a video of you answering one or both of the following questions. Where have you encountered God during lockdown? And what one thing has God taught you during this time? Where have you encountered God during lockdown? And what one thing has God taught you during this time? If you haven't already sent me an answer to those questions and you'd like to, please send me a video or a message by the end of the day tomorrow so that I can stitch them all together. And then we can be encouraged by the way in which God has continued to work and move in our lives, even during this difficult time. But for today, we're in the Bible and we've thought about how God has worked in and through Noah, Sarah, Jacob and Moses. We've looked at how he was there for the Israelites, how he met Elijah and Jonah in their deepest need, how he revealed himself to Nebuchadnezzar through the actions of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. Last week we considered how our relationship with God changes over time as we learn and grow and change, just like Mary's relationship with Jesus changed. Time and again what we've seen is that our God chooses to work in us and through us, that he is seeking to build relationships of love with us. This week we're thinking about that passage which Viv read to us, about a man named Saul, who maybe we know better as the Apostle Paul. A man who encountered Jesus Christ, God the Son, in a blazing light on the road to Damascus. So let's talk about Saul. I need to apologise right at the start because I'm probably going to get confused and call him both Paul and Saul this morning. Just know that whichever name I use, Saul or Paul, I'm speaking about the same person. So who was Saul? Saul, he was a Roman citizen. This was because he was born in the Roman city of Tarsus, which is part of modern-day Turkey. In Acts 23, Paul tells us that he is a Pharisee from a line of Pharisees. We know that Jesus didn't always get on too well with the Pharisees, often accusing them of being hypocrites. The Pharisees were like a religious political pressure group. They had no official authority, but some of the religious officials in Jerusalem did belong to that group. Many of them were scholars of Jewish religious texts, our Old Testament, as well as teachings and explanations by well-respected experts in the law. They sought to understand God's law, the law that had been given to the people by God under Moses, and to find the best way of living that law out a few thousand years later. When they encounter Jesus, we find them trying to protect and enforce their own interpretation of God's laws against him, as so often he seems to dismiss their way of doing things, what they believe to be right. Saul's a few years younger than Jesus, but would have fitted right in with his fellow Pharisees, who Christ was so critical of. Saul also had a commission from the high priest to go to Damascus and deal with the Christians there, and this was really rare for someone outside of the normal temple hierarchy to be given such authority. It's more than possible the high priest simply wanted someone else to do his dirty work for him. Saul has certainly made a big impression though. And whatever else we might say about Saul, he was passionate about his faith. He persecuted Christians not because he was an evil man, but because he believed they were causing God's people to turn away from the Lord. You see, Saul loved God and he wanted to live his life as best he could according to God's law. That was what being a Pharisee was all about. And so when he saw this group, these followers of Jesus, encouraging Jewish men and women to ignore so much of what the Pharisees felt was an important part of honouring God, and instead following the teaching of this man who had so recently been crucified, Saul did everything in his power to make them stop. It was because of his passion for God that he persecuted Christians, because he was sure he was doing the right thing for God. This was Saul. But it wasn't who Saul remained. We often talk about this experience of Saul on the road to Damascus as being one of the most dramatic conversions of all in history. In all of history, not just the event itself, which was more than dramatic enough, but Saul went from being one who persecuted Christians to the man who wrote more books in the New Testament, the exclusive Christian part of the Bible, than anyone else. In terms of his views on Christianity, it was a complete about-face, from persecuting those who follow Jesus to working hard to share the good news of Jesus with as many others as possible. More than that, he went from being the most Jewish of Jews, as he described himself, one to whom interaction with unclean Gentiles was to be avoided for fear he might be contaminated by them. He went from being that to being the apostle to the Gentiles, the one of God's people whose mission it was particularly to take the good news of Jesus to the non-Jewish peoples of the world, a task given him by Christ himself. It's a big about face. However, I'm not really sure that the change within Saul was all that big. The change within him. Let me explain. Before his experience on the road to Damascus, the main driving force in Saul's life and in his actions was the will of God. He was doing what he believed God wanted him to do. He was passionately pursuing what he believed to be God's will for the world. After Saul's experience on the Damascus road, the driving force in his life was exactly the same. Both before and afterwards, Saul was giving everything he had, doing his very best to do the will of God as he understood it. What changed, I think, wasn't so much Saul. He was broadly the same man before and after his conversion, a man passionate about working with and for God. What changed wasn't so much Saul himself as it was his knowledge of God. Think about that for a moment. The change was relatively small. The change was that Saul went from believing one thing about Jesus Christ, that Jesus was a false Messiah, to believing something different, that Jesus was in fact God's own son. What happened was, on that road, Saul got to know God better. Saul learned something about God, about Jesus. Saul came to a much deeper understanding of God than he had had before. And through getting to know God better on the road to Damascus, through an encounter with God in which Saul learned something about our Lord, the history of the world was changed. Because once the person who Saul was, his passion for doing the work of God, once that was redirected in the right way, his impact on the spread of faith of Jesus Christ was phenomenal. That relatively small change, what one man believed about Jesus, had a huge impact. And the same can be true of us as well, because our knowledge of God, our relationships with Father, Son and Spirit can change the direction of our lives and impact the lives of many others too. Saul was persecuting the followers of Jesus. Saul encountered God in Christ on the road to Damascus and discovered something about God he'd not known before. And the direction of Saul's life changed, and that change impacted the whole world. So what does that mean for us today? I'm going to offer you some thoughts about that. And as I offer you thoughts about what this might mean for us today, I want you to bear in mind these well-known verses from the start of Romans 12. Saul himself, Paul, writes this. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. Bear that in mind. Let me start by talking about Pharisees, because to be honest, I think that those of us who are already Christians, those of us who are already part of the church, we are in a real and constant danger of ending up like the Pharisees, of being like Pharisees, as Jesus encountered them. Remember that Saul, before his conversion, and the Pharisees more generally, they were doing their best to obey God. They were trying to do his will and to help others do the same. And this is surely true of us as the church as well. We are doing our best to do the will of God and to help others too. The truth is that as Christians, the danger of becoming like the hypocritical Pharisees is far more real than the danger of being like ungodly Gentiles. The danger is that we think we know God and what he wants from us, and we pursue it with passion. That we think we know everything about him. But if our relationship with the Lord is not alive and healthy, our actions might turn out to be a long way from the will of God. We need to examine about what we believe about God, about his will, what we understand about his word and the sort of people he calls us to be. We need to be able to carefully appraise whether what we think about God, about the world, about ourselves and about other people truly matches with our living God. Because the only way for us to avoid becoming like the Pharisees of Jesus' time, like Saul before his conversion, hypocritical, judgmental, misguided. The only way to avoid what God is doing entirely, even avoid working to counter his purposes, is to have a living, loving relationship with him. To strive to know him just as he wants to know us. Because if we don't have a living relationship with him, just like the Pharisees, we might end up earnestly working for what we think is right, but really be on completely the wrong page. And of course, the way in which we get to know him better, it hasn't changed in the last 2,000 years. The way in which we get to know him better is the same way we get to know anyone better. We learn about them and we spend time with them. We learn about God, we get to know him better by reading the Bible and spending time with him in prayer and worship. We get to know him better by spending his time with people, learning about him together, praying and worshipping and working for him together. We get to know him better by working alongside him. And we need to do all of that with a pinch of humility. We need to do it ready for him to correct us, to show us, to point us in a new direction when we're wrong, to be humble enough to consider that our understanding of God and his will is not perfect, and that he may need to correct us through the Bible, by his Spirit, through his people in our times together. We need, as the people of God, to be constantly ready and willing to have our minds renewed, changed, transformed. That's what Romans 12 tells us, that we should be transformed by the renewing of our minds. It's not a one-off thing, it's a lifelong process. Our minds need to be changed. And as they are, as our minds are changed, Paul writes in Romans, then we will be able to test and approve what God's will is. As I close, I've got some questions for you to consider. Here's the first one. How do you think that God is going to go about transforming you and using you to transform the world around you? Unless you're perfect, which, let me assure you, you're not. God still wants to transform you, to change you, to help you be better, to help you be the person he designed you to be, to help you live your best life according to his plans for you. But for that to happen, you need to change. You need to be willing to change. The only way in which you're going to be transformed is by the renewal of your mind, by changing your mind, the way you see the world, the way you think about some things, the way you act, and the things you say will flow from that. How is he going to go about transforming you? Maybe like Saul, it's by an encounter, it's by getting to know him better. I wonder when the last time you changed your mind was. And I don't mean about something trivial like what to have for dinner later. I mean about something important that you believe deep down. When was the last time you allowed God to change your mind about something? When was the last time you were even willing to consider changing your mind? Remember, Saul believed that what he was doing was for God. In order for Saul's behaviour to change, for him to go from persecuting Jesus to preaching for him, Saul had to change his mind. And it may be that God needs to change your mind about something too, in order that you can live and work effectively for him. So how open are you to having your mind changed? I want to challenge you today. Invite God to change your mind about something. Ask him to show you what might need to change. And know for sure that an encounter with God, know that getting to know him better, it can change you. It can change your world. And getting to know him better, and that effect of it changing you and changing your world, it means that through you, God will be able to change the world and the lives of others as well. What might need to change in you? What might God be wanting to change through you?